As many of you likely heard in the NME trainings, consistency and structure is supportive of all students and is going to be especially critical this year, especially as we navigate this new normal of virtual learning. So the more we can think through our structures before our students return, and the more we're able to create those predictable spaces, expectations, and routines, the more likely it is that our students will know what to expect, what is expected of them, and will ultimately be more ready and able to engage in learning. So, the first thing we want to plan for when thinking about support is how to structure the virtual classroom itself, because the way in which the classroom is structured greatly influences student behavior, their motivational levels, and their overall attitudes towards school. And this is true in both of our physical and virtual environments, although considerations are going to look slightly different depending on the space in which you're teaching. So all of these considerations can be found on the checklist that we referenced earlier, but we also wanted to take a minute to talk through each further. So the first is really around the efficiency of student monitoring. Is your learning platform configured so that you can monitor students relatively efficiently? And how might that monitoring look different depending on the instructional strategies or the platforms you're using? So considerations may include monitoring for whole group instruction versus breakout sessions versus asynchronous learning opportunities, etc. The next is around student access to materials. So can students access any materials they need relatively efficiently? Some considerations here may be, are there specific materials they need to access and have with them before they even come into the virtual classroom? Or are there materials they may need once they enter into the classroom? And have you taught or have a plan to teach procedures for accessing those materials? The next is around the home environment support. And again, this is going to depend on the age group of your students, but how are we planning to provide support for students and families in terms of structuring the home environment to sort of minimize distractions and set our students up for success? So it may be supporting families and creating consistent routines in the home, what a structured space might look like. And again, those sort of systems that families are aware of if and when they need to reach out for further support, just as we discussed earlier in the connections section. Next are those considerations for student interaction. So in other words, does the schedule of your learning activities provide consistency, but also variety and multiple opportunities for students to interact? So again, those interactions are going to promote not only connection and relationship building amongst students, but it's also going to promote engagement in whatever content you're teaching. And then last but not least, have you considered what your beginning and ending routines look like for each instructional activity and block? Those are great places, again, to build those connection opportunities that we discussed earlier and providing that consistent structure for your classroom. So as we were thinking about routines, we wanted to take a minute to talk through this language of procedures, routines, and expectations, because we talk about all of them within the context of structure, but it's also important to know how they are connected and yet different. So a large part of what we need to think through before the first day are procedures. And procedures define how things are done within your classroom. So again, how will students enter your virtual classroom? What is their do now when they arrive? How might they ask questions? How would you like them to respond to you, respond to peers, take a break if needed? And once we know our procedures, we can begin to establish those routines. And routines are those procedures that are done consistently and are necessary for your classroom to run smoothly and for your students to know how to navigate the classroom. And then additionally, when we know our procedures and routines, students are best able to meet those behavioral expectations. And that's a critical feature of your virtual classroom and what we're going to be talking about next. So we know that it's important to define, teach, and practice the behavior we want to see. And this is a hallmark of classroom management. And it's especially important in this virtual setting, which we know is a new environment for pretty much all of our students, as well as us. So when students guess on how they're supposed to behave, the result is often confusion, and that's where misbehaviors often happen. And honestly could have been avoided had we taught those behavioral expectations from the get-go. Be aware that expectations are going to be different for each type of instructional activity, transition, and space in which you're teaching, which is why we not only want to define our expectations, but we want to also be thinking through how those expectations can be taught and reinforced in your various routines and virtual classroom spaces. So next, we wanted to provide you with some steps and considerations for developing a remote instructional behavior matrix, which we would highly recommend you taking the time to think about before that first day of school, and also engaging your students in this process as well. So the first, if your school has school-wide behavior expectations, we highly advise that you keep the same expectations for your classroom matrix. Students are going to benefit from that consistent language of the school's expectations and values, and applying them online will help them see that the same systems apply regardless of location. So whether they're in your classroom, at home in front of a screen, or back in our buildings, those same expectations are there. In terms of your settings when creating this matrix, you're going to use your online activities as your settings. So instead of defining expectations by locations around the school, which you probably have seen in the past, excuse me, we recommend using the most common virtual activities or routines that you're going to use in your classroom. So you'll see some example matrices on the next slides, but some things to consider are what are the activities that students may experience in your virtual classroom? So that could include teacher-led instruction, independent asynchronous work, one-on-one work, small group activities, etc. And then are there any subject-specific activities or platform-specific activities? So if your expectations for behavior vary based on, the platform or subject area, consider noting these as you organize your matrix as well. Next, consider online-specific behaviors that need to be taught. So these are those behaviors that are unique to remote instruction, and those are especially important to teach and practice. So some areas to consider when creating that matrix, use of video, right? Are we requiring students to have their video on at all times or only for specific activities? Same with use of audio. Do you want them to respond by voice or stay muted? Are they using the chat box? All things that we want to think through so that we can then make sure we're practicing and providing as expectations on that matrix as well. And then last but not least, teach directly. We know there's so much to do, and that pressure can lead us to simply share the matrix and move on and assume it's understood. But please resist that temptation. Explicit teaching and practice is going to be needed to use these new skills with fluency. So in teaching, consider how you're going to make that instruction and modeling and practicing as active as possible. So how might students contribute to co-creating examples of following the expectations across activities? How might they model and practice those expectations with each other in order to make that instruction more interactive? There's lots of creative ways to do this and make it fun, but the more time we take on the front end, practicing our expectations and teaching them explicitly, the better off we'll be as the year progresses. And then I advise you to come back and check these out further, but we wanted to provide you some examples of what a matrix might look like. So this is an example of an elementary classroom matrix modified for the virtual space. This one is from our very own South Middle School, and this is an example of a school level matrix that has been modified. They use their South Strong school-wide expectations. And that provides a great starting point for teachers when creating their matrix for their own online classroom. And another consideration is in those secondary spaces, thinking about how and if you can collaborate with other teachers. So that's supportive not only of students in terms of, knowing what to expect in multiple virtual spaces, but it also will help lighten that load for you and provide you with some thought partnering opportunities. So before we pause and give you a minute to sort of reflect and apply, we wanted to leave you with some of those expectation considerations and reminders. So first, behavior should be taught and modeled in the virtual space, right? If we are expecting them to demonstrate those defined behaviors, then it's absolutely necessary that we're able to teach those behaviors and that we provide ourselves and our students adequate time to do so. Creating a system to monitor behavior expectations. So monitoring behavior throughout is going to allow you to acknowledge expected behaviors and also respond to behavior errors with reteaching and reminders. And we're going to talk about that further in the next section. And then how will you build in time to teach those expectations? So we know we need to spend significant amount of time here initially, but what's your plan to provide ongoing instruction around expectations? And how might this look when and if we move in and out of the virtual space as the year goes on? So again, we are going to take a moment here to pause and let you fill out your note catcher, capture any thoughts you might have, and next steps related to classroom structures, procedures, routines, and expectations. And you will also find in the Google Classroom a blank fillable matrix that hopefully is supportive if you don't have one of those yet in getting you started. And then there's also going to be additional resources that we will discuss in the next section related to these considerations as well.